Last November, I took a road trip out to my family's home for Thanksgiving. I lived around 20 hours away, which in road trip time is about 3 days of driving comfortably, and 2 days if really pushing it. This drive I'd done before, and hated it every time because of how incredibly boring most of it was. My parents lived on a small ranch that to me felt like the middle of nowhere, so a big portion of the drive was through nothing, either just plain open fields or vast untouched forests. After hours and hours of the same scenery, it always got painfully boring. The first half of the drive from leaving my city was always alright though. It was on the typical highways that mostly everyone takes if they were headed to or from a major city. However, it was toward the end of my second day of driving that I merged off of that highway and onto, I guess you'd call, a side road. It was still a highway, but only one lane, and way less people drove on it, not truckers or anything. And it really only led out to smaller, less distinguished towns. I made it to this part around 7 or 8 in the afternoon, so I wasn't planning to drive too much longer. I hoped there would be a town I could pull off in that had a motel or something. I drove another 2-ish hours. The road was completely dark and empty, just my headlights lighting up the way through the fog. I hadn't seen a single place to pull off and sleep at, so eventually when I found a small gas station, I figured it was better than nothing, and pulled in. Now this gas station looked extremely old. It looked like it was just some sort of family-owned place, in the middle of nothing. I didn't see a single light in the distance of any sort of town or even houses. However, the gas station's lights were on, and I was able to use the pump to top off my tank. Afterward, I parked in a spot on the side of the building, and headed inside to ask if I could sleep for a few hours in their parking lot. When I walked in, a single guy was standing behind the counter, looked maybe 50, and was taken aback by me walking in. Guess customers don't usually stop by this late. I asked him if I could park for a couple hours. He mentioned right away that the station was closing in 15 minutes, and he would be leaving, but that if I was comfortable staying at the empty place overnight, then he didn't mind. I thanked him and bought a couple energy drinks for tomorrow, then headed back out to my car. But I replayed the conversation in my head, and I thought it was kind of weird the way he said, if I was comfortable. It sounded like he was saying I really shouldn't be, or that most people around here wouldn't be comfortable with it. I figured maybe he meant that most people just didn't sleep in their cars, and not that sleeping in my car here specifically is the problem. I got back in my car and laid the seat back, setting an alarm for 3 a.m., which was about 4 hours from then. After 15 minutes, I heard the guy lock up the gas station doors, and his car drive away. I looked around. Now, without the gas station lights on, it was pitch black, and extremely quiet. It was actually kind of eerie, being alone there. I closed my eyes again. Honestly, I'm unsure whether I fell asleep or not, because my eyes were closed and I was trying to for so long, at least an hour or so, when I suddenly heard the sound of tires pulling into the gravel outside of the gas station. They got closer and closer, until I eventually opened my eyes to see what was going on. I felt my heart get a little faster, seeing a dark pickup truck right beside my car. What the hell were they doing here? None of their headlights were on either. I couldn't see the driver, or really anything other than the truck outlined by the darkness around it. But it was facing me, so I felt like there was a chance whoever was in there could see me. I got really uncomfortable, and didn't want to take any chances. I quickly put my seat back up, turned my car on, and drove out of there. I hoped it was nothing, but the way it all happened felt really strange. An empty, closed gas station in the middle of nowhere, and a truck decides to pull in with all its lights off, and pull right up to my car. Couldn't really think of how that wasn't something bad. Getting out of there and back on the road made me feel a lot safer though. However, I barely got a quarter mile away from the gas station before I hit something in the middle of the gravel road. I only caught a glimpse of it in my headlights before my tire ran it over, and it sounded like a pretty bad hit. I quickly pulled off to the side and looked in my rear mirror, but couldn't get a good enough look, so I put the car in park and stepped out. Again, I noticed how quiet it was outside. Just the cold wind blowing around as I walked down the road and tried to see what it was that I hit. It looked like a large duffel bag, but like really large. And honestly, the reason I was so curious as to get out and look is because it kind of looked like a body bag. Maybe it was just my mind's tendency to always think the worst. But I didn't even get close enough to it before hearing the distant sound of tires pushing through the gravel down the road. I looked up and saw nothing but pitch black as the sound got closer and closer. I ran back to my car and got in. I glanced in my mirror as the sound got even louder before that truck suddenly appeared in my back headlights. Looked like they were going insanely fast, speeding right past the object in the road and suddenly slamming on their brakes and swerving behind my car, abruptly stopping. The front and side door both opened and 2 men jumped out, but by then I was already flooring it back down the road. I couldn't believe how much my hands were shaking as I tried to call 911. Each time, the call would connect for a couple of seconds, then the line would drop because I had no signal. Thankfully, I don't think the truck continued to follow me though, as I never saw them again. That stretch of road went on for maybe 45 minutes before I found a different road to get on that led to a more populated area. Calling the police at that point probably didn't help much, but I did anyway. Half hour later, I got a call back saying they found nothing at all in the area. The rest of the drive, and honestly the entire trip, I was genuinely horrified of what I might have stumbled across that night. I don't know what that truck was up to, or what I saw in the middle of the road, but thinking about what it all could have been still gives me chills. I never took that way ever again, and haven't heard of any information as to what might have happened that night. I was on a road trip from basically the East Coast to the West Coast. I had plans to meet up with some friends, but was also taking the road trip just for fun. I'd only ever flown to individual cities in the West, so I was excited to check out or at least drive through some of the other areas. I had the whole route planned, but on my 3rd day of driving, I entered a part of the highway that was under heavy construction. My maps told me there was a road closure ahead, and directed me to get off the highway and onto a small 1-lane road that went right along the highway. Now, right away, I did notice that no other cars seemed to get off when I did. They all were turning and going a different way. However, I figured it was just that they were all headed in a different direction. Maybe there was a big city that way or something. I didn't know because I didn't know the area. I wasn't worried about it because my maps told me to go this way, and it was pretty much just going right along the highway anyways. Only difference was it was a smaller road and a lower speed limit. I think I got on this road around 7, so it was already dark. I should mention this trip was just toward the beginning of winter, and it was snowing a bit during this part of the road trip. Anyway, as I got further and further down this road, I only became more aware of just how empty it was, and eventually it veered away from the main highway and out into what looked like nothing. I had no idea where it was leading me, but my maps said I was still going the right way, and the estimated time to arrive at my destination looked normal, so I figured I was still good. After an hour at least, I saw a cluster of lights in the distance. Looked like a small town, which was great because I was running low on gas. Few minutes later, I was close enough to see that this cluster of lights really was only maybe 15 to 20 buildings. None of them had anything more than a couple of small outdoor lights on. The small town looked very old and run down, and honestly deserted. Sure, there were some lights on, but it still felt off. I drove up to the gas station, just some small vacant building on the edge of the town. There was a flickering light on the overhang, and the pump seemed to be working, so I got out and started filling the tank. Oddly, there was actually another car at the gas station. It was a small grayish SUV, parked at the pump across from me. Its windows weren't tinted or anything, so I could clearly see through them. Looked like there was a bunch of stuff packed in it, suitcases and whatnot, looking like they too were on a road trip. But nobody was inside of it, and nobody was outside of the car either. Wasn't sure where they were, because the gas station building was clearly closed, and this SUV definitely didn't belong to this town. It looked like they were just passing through. I started to feel a little more uncomfortable. The town had this really eerie feeling to it. It was also real quiet out there. The dead silence gave me shivers every time I looked out at the darkness and the empty streets. To make things worse, the gas was filling up extremely slow. Took a whole minute just for a single gallon, which probably wasn't even enough to get over to the next town, wherever the hell that was. And I think it was after being there for 2 minutes, waiting in the dark silence, that there was a sudden scream in the distance. It was a male voice screaming for help. I was so on edge already that it made me jump back and slam my shoulder against the gas pump. I stared out in the direction it came from, but it was a complete blackout. There was something about the voice that didn't feel right. I took a few steps away from my car, just to get a clearer view of the area. Then the man yelled again. He was way closer this time, like somewhere in the dark right outside of the gas station. I looked out there for just about 20 seconds, listening to the eerie silence that followed his voice, before sudden movement in the side of my view caught my attention. It looked like someone running through the dark toward the back of the gas station, and almost as soon as I saw that, something else moved in another part of the dark. I felt like I was going insane, and my gut told me to get the hell out of this town immediately. I quickly started taking the pump out. As I did, I could hear multiple people running around in the grass just outside of the gas station. I hurried into my car, and that's when several guys came out of the dark, clearly all coordinated in whatever plan they had. They began sprinting toward me just as I got it into drive. I sped out of there and straight back onto the deserted road. I keep thinking about that empty car that was there, seeming to be on a road trip just like I was, probably getting there just a few minutes before I did. Was the person calling out for help in the dark attacked by the same men I saw? Or maybe the person calling out for help is what lured the other driver out there, only for who knows what to happen. There wasn't even a police station at that town, so although I reported the situation, I have no idea if they even drove out there to look. I never got any updates on what really happened at that town. I was 23 and driving across the country in a small van. It wasn't one of those really nice ones, with the whole setup or anything. Mine wasn't big and basically just had a mattress in the back, with a bunch of stuff in cardboard boxes all over the floor. My parents lived on the West Coast, where I was headed to store a lot of my stuff at their place, while I figured out my whole situation. It was kind of a mess, to be honest. Anyway, this was my first time even going on a drive this far, and not staying in any hotels along the way. The first full day went decently. It was exhausting, but manageable. I think I drove a total of 14 hours, so by the time I felt ready to stop for the night, it was around 12 a.m. There was a sign for a rest stop in 20 miles, which I assumed would have a bunch of truckers and other cars also staying there to sleep. However, when I pulled in, I immediately noticed how wrong I was. The rest stop was down an exit ramp from the highway and went sort of into a wooded area, with trees covering all views of the road, and there wasn't a single car or truck there. When I parked and looked around, I got a really unsettling feeling. It was so tucked away and isolated from the highway, and with nobody else around, it felt almost like I was parked at an abandoned building in the middle of a desolate forest. You'd think nobody being around would be peaceful, but it was the exact opposite. I turned my van off and got out to go into the building and use the restroom. Couldn't even hear any cars on the highway. It was just the calm sound of cicadas in the trees. I walked into the rest stop, and it was fairly clean. I don't know if that meant people were here a lot, or the other way around. As I walked back to my van, though, I got that uneasy feeling again. The forest around me was really dense, and it almost felt like something or someone was lurking out there. Of course, I chalked the feeling up to being nervous about my first time sleeping in a van at a rest stop, and nothing more. I got inside and pulled a curtain across the front of the cab, blocking any views from the front into the back. Then I laid down on my mattress, and despite all the unsettling feelings, I was exhausted enough to fall asleep pretty much instantly. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to hearing voices outside of the van. I quickly sat up and listened. Sounded like two men talking somewhere just outside of my van, maybe in the parking spot right next to mine. I checked the time. It was 3 a.m. I thought it was almost impossible that the parking lot went from completely empty to full enough that someone would park right next to me, but I really hoped that was the case. I got up and pulled the curtains back just enough to peek my head out. I looked out at the parking area and didn't see a single other car. Then I looked out the other window, instantly locking eyes with a man staring right at me from just outside the window. I froze, and the man quickly went behind the van walls, away from the window. I backed away and pulled the curtains across the front. Then I froze again. I heard both men whisper back and forth, before it suddenly went quiet. Neither were talking, and I didn't hear any movement. I must have waited 5 minutes before pulling the curtain back and looking around. As it seemed, the men were gone. I looked in all directions, even checking the mirrors, but they were nowhere. They must have snuck away into the woods, which made me even more unsettled. I grabbed my keys, turned on the van, and pulled out of the rest stop. No way I was going to sleep there after that. I started driving, and I'm not sure if the light hadn't come on yet, or if I was too focused on getting away from there to realize it right away, but I made it just halfway up the ramp leading onto the highway when I noticed my van was really struggling to gain speed. Then I noticed a blinking red light on my dash. It was for my back right tire, and as soon as I saw it, I could feel it too. The wheel felt like it was dragging on the pavement. I looked in the mirror, and it was even more noticeable from there. My stomach sank. It had to be those men outside the van. I really did my best not to panic, but all the horrifying thoughts started to flood my mind. I frantically looked in the mirrors, making sure the guys weren't coming up from anywhere, as I thought of the best way to get out of this situation. The big problem was that since I had stopped on an incline from the road connecting to the highway, the van couldn't go up with the busted tire. And then I heard something outside. I looked up at the forest beside me. I stared out for a second, feeling the tension rising, before a sudden knock came at the window next to me. It was that guy, smiling and knocking on my window. "Hey, need some help? I can change that tire for you, if you need. Don't think you'll be getting out of here anytime soon, with the wheel looking like that," he said in a disturbingly calm voice. I found it really creepy that he didn't come up in a car or anything, and he never mentioned the other guy that I knew I heard him talking to before. I was so scared though, I didn't even respond. I got my phone out and started dialing 911, hoping the man seeing me call the police would scare him enough to leave. But the man knocked on the window again, saying he'd help me and that I didn't need to call anyone. As I started explaining my situation to the operator, the man got more aggressive, hitting the window and even trying to open the door, which was when I knew I couldn't wait for the cops to get here. I needed to leave immediately. I put the van in reverse and started rolling back down the ramp. I'm not gonna lie, it sounded like the van was dying. The scraping and thumping from the wheel, knowing it could fall off and get me even more stranded, was terrifying. The man followed as well, trying to chase my van down to the rest stop. Once I was back on the flat surface of the parking lot, I floored it, this time not stopping on the incline, and barely my van made it up to the highway. I drove a bit, still with the tire making awful sounds and probably killing my van. Then I pulled off and waited for the cops. The men didn't seem to have a car, and they didn't seem to chase me onto the highway, probably because the rest stop was isolated, and they could get away with whatever they were trying without any witnesses around. But when the cops arrived and looked for them, they were gone. I'm pretty sure had I stayed in my van and not tried to leave, the men would have broken inside. And if I'd opened the door or let the man try to fix my tire, which obviously he had slashed, the other guy was likely hiding in the forest nearby, waiting to jump me. What they were really trying, I'm not sure. Maybe it was to steal my van and everything in it. But from everything that happened, leaving me as a witness seems unlikely. So I have a feeling that night was really close to being my last.